Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. A real pleasure to be able to speak to you today. How are you?
Hi, Sarah. I'm good, thank you.
Maybe you could begin
How
with
are
a brief
you?
introduction to this wonderful documentary, Collective Monologue. What can people expect when they watch the film?
They can expect a lot of animals, a lot of touch and relationships between carers and animals, histories of zoos. That's what they can expect mostly, I think.
And maybe you can talk us through how the project came about. When you first discovered this eco park in Argentina, why you were sort of inspired to make the film, and particularly building your relationship with Maka in the film, which obviously becomes a key part of it and a key thread that runs through the film.
My family is from Argentina, so I spent quite a bit of time in Buenos Aires Zoo as a child. I was very aware of it. My previous projects have to do with the relationship between humans and animals and conservation within museums, but also ecologically. So it's a theme that continues within my work in general. The zoo closed in 2016 due to animal rights activists and also carers within the zoo who were protesting for the care and the rights of the animals and the conditions that they were in. And it reopened in 2019, and they began to translocate quite a few of the animals. And that's when I started revisiting the zoo. I started off particularly interested in the architecture of the zoo. So, for example, the elephants live in a Hindu temple, which is so the animals live in replicas of the architecture of where they come, the countries where they come from, which this kind of absurd idea of animals firstly just living in architecture and secondly trying to replicate their countries of origin, which originally when the zoo was conceived in the 1880s, it was seen as kind of an educational tool. So someone would go and visit, they'd see the elephant, they'd see the Hindu temple, and they'd understand immediately where the animal would come from. And nowadays, for example, instead of there being Indian elephants in the temple, there are African elephants. So this kind of absurdist human kind of manipulation continues. So that was really what started, and we had access issues with the Buenos Aires Zoo. So while we were working that out, I became friends. I spent a lot of time on the ground meeting people, and I met Maga, who was also working. She was working at Buenos Aires Zoo, but she was also working at La Plata Zoo, where we really had full access. And so I began filming with her and spending time with her. It was a process of 5 years of working with her and making this film.
And I know you've often worked with 16 millimeter, shooting on 16 millimeter, but with a film like this, it's almost quite surprising because you can imagine you were filming with digital, you'd maybe have so much footage, but you have to be so much more selective when you're shooting on film. So what drove that decision? And then I guess combining that with the surveillance footage, so you've got that kind of contrast.
So, like you said, I've worked with film since I started making films, like in 2006. One of the reasons that I enjoy working with 16 millimeter is kind of the discipline of it. So we shot probably around 7 hours, 6, 7 hours of footage over the 5 years, which isn't a lot for people that work with digital. So something that I love about that is that I could go in and see Maga one day, but we'd only have 3 or 10 minutes of footage. So we'd spend most of the day just hanging out and seeing her work, or just spending time with her, drinking mate, or hanging out, hearing her story. She's an absolutely incredible storyteller. So, and becoming like building a relationship, becoming friends, really. So that's something that film allows you to do because of the cost of it, because of the time. It really makes you focus on like what you want to film and not be filming the whole time. So there isn't a lot of material. And I really love that discipline. I love the texture of it. I shot on a camera that I was a fellow at the Film Study Center at Harvard University, and I was lucky enough to use a camera that belonged to the filmmaker Robert Gardner, who was a documentary filmmaker and anthropologist from the 1960s. So there's also like an interesting connection of the technology that's being used. The La Plata Zoo, which is a biopark now, renamed biopark, where Maga now works full time. She doesn't work in Buenos Aires Zoo anymore. They didn't have camera traps. And I was always interested in this idea of what happens when you put this camera that is normally meant for filming animals in the wild and seeing animals in the wild doing things that we haven't seen before because it's nighttime and it's triggered by their motion, it's infrared. What happens when we put that in a zoo? And what happens when we put that in the zoo is mostly we just see animals going around in circles. I donated a camera to Maga and the Bioparque, and we started putting them in different enclosures. And it really helped Maga also understand animals at night, like what do they need? Like, how are they responding to sounds? How are they responding to where they put the food at night and things like that? Yeah, and then the surveillance footage, like the CCTV cameras, is something that they put in the last 2 years because they had a lot of, unfortunately, animals stolen a lot. There are a lot of robberies in La Plata Zoo. So that was the main reason that they had that in place, so that that would happen less or not at all. But yeah, there's this kind of idea of surveillance. But even like if you think about it, Maga in a way is also part of the surveillance that these animals have because she's having to watch over them and care for them, which wouldn't happen if they were in the wild. So this idea of surveillance, it's not only these kind of digital, like newer technologies, it's also like the part of the human interaction is a way of surveilling as well.
There are so many sort of evocative images in the film, particularly this one where their hair's intertwining with the howler monkey. So how do those images also feed into your interest in this exploration of this idea of the interaction between humans and animals and where that sort of boundary is, ideas of touch and making contact?
I think the way that I film, that I hopefully that's visible in the way that I film animals and humans, non-human animals and humans in the film is quite horizontal. So I don't prioritize Maga over the howler monkeys or over Majo, the historian, over the conservator that's conserving like the architecture of a building, or Alicia with the anteaters. I kind of try and keep this horizontality within the way that I'm approaching these different moments of care and interaction and tanglement. So the kind of, like you said, like Maga's hair being confused with Venus's. There's this entanglement that we have that as humans we have tried to separate in the past few hundred years, but we have this entanglement with animals and with nature that's undeniable and that I only wish for us to pay more attention to. So hopefully, yeah, that's something that is evident in the film and that I've tried to do very consciously. Like the violence of the history, the violence of the present as well, and how we can think of alternative ways of changing that into the future. I think it's all to do with process as well. There's not one change that will help. It's like many ways of changes, and I think changing of mentality and listening, like part of the reason of collective monologue has to do with lack of listening.
How this essay about the smell of the animals, I wonder how that sort of sparked your inspiration and how that kind of fed into the look and the feel that's in the film.
So I was with Majo, who's the historian. We spent time looking through the archives and reading them. So the magazines were published from 1880 when the zoo opened until like the 1930s 30s. And we spent time reading through these magazines. I spent a lot of time alone reading through them. And I encountered this text by the second director, Clemente Donelli, who was the second director of the zoo. And when I read it, it's him describing it's a tour of the zoo through the smells. And it was just so incredible. It's something that I had rented an apartment that looks over Buenos Aires Zoo on República de la India, which is one of the streets that the zoo is on. When I would talk to my neighbors, something that they would say that historically or like in the past, they could smell the animals from their apartments. Like that was something very visceral, that they knew that they were in close proximity to elephants and to lions or polar bears because of the smell that reached their apartments. And that was something I always had in mind. And because of this kind of multi-sensory film only really has image and sound in a way, it's this and trying to like bring in these different elements of senses, of touch, of smell. I think the way that we as humans, we classify things, like we classify animals, we classify other beings, is through sight. That's like our primary classification tool and our primary sense in a way. But trying to like bring in these other senses, like not only like listening, like I mentioned already, but the smell, the touch, trying to bring in these other kind of elements that we are more than capable of interacting with, was something that I was really interested in. And there was a point where when I read that text, I was like, oh, this is the whole film, is this text. It ended up just being a part in the middle, but it really blew my mind. The details that he went into, like describing the feet of the baby bears and how they smelt, so precise.
It's very visceral as an experience watching the film, and it doesn't feel that conventional as a documentary. Would you say you take reference or inspiration from other kind of documentary filmmakers, or is a lot of influence of the way you make films from your sort of multidisciplinary artistic background?
I think it's a mix of both. I take inspiration from documentary filmmakers like Chick Strand or Frederick Wiseman, Roberto Minervini, like people like that are great influences. But then I also take influence from literature, from artists, from more kind of artist film as well. Well, Chick Strand would go into that, but yeah, there are lots of different pathways that I get inspiration from, and then in a way, the way that I film is usually a response to the people that I'm working with. So the way that Maca interacts with Venus or Juanita or the monkeys or the animals in general, like the closeness she has to them, the intricacies of touch. I'm in a way like simulating that through the closeness that I'm filming, and I'm recording sound as well. So there's kind of this repetition or this replicating of care in the way that I approach the camera.
Along the journey of making the film, were there any really challenging moments, or on the flip side, a real highlight? I mean, I don't know, perhaps because you're not filming everything on digital, were there any moments where you thought, oh my gosh, I wish I'd had the camera out just to that moment and now I've missed it? Or because you're used to filming in that way that you don't sort of get too attached and, you know, you're happy to capture what you capture?
We had access issues with Buenos Aires Zoo, so that was really a challenge. And also we had COVID in the middle. It's a 5-year project, so we started shooting in 2019. So that was the most challenging. And then also it is challenging. It's a nice challenge to film with carers and animals, because I'd go into the zoo with Maca, and there would be days like the scene with the tamandua, the animal that they weigh. I saw that the first day that Maca took me to La Plata Zoo. That was the first thing I saw. And I loved the way that the Isa, the tamandua, came out of the enclosure, and she kind of weighed herself in a way. And because of the way that they work with animals, even though that was something that I had in mind 5 years ago, it took us 5 years to film, because every time I'd be there and every time I'd want to film that, or I'd have the desire to film that, Isa didn't want to come out of her enclosure and be weighed. So it was like really, it's like a listening exercise, both on Maga and patience on my. It's like patience and listening through Maga with the animals, and also with Maga because Juanita was a huge thing. That Juanita was very sick during the whole shoot, and unfortunately, after we recorded the scene with her, she passed away a week later. So that was so tough for Maga. So also like being very respectful for that. She has Juanita tattooed on her back. Like she has Isa as well. She has 5 animals, and the only animal that's left, right, that's alive is Isa, who's left on her back. So Juanita was like a huge, huge deal for her. She'd known her for 20 years. So like just really having respect and listening is a challenge, but it's a beautiful challenge. Like I wouldn't make these sorts of films if I wouldn't love these challenges. I also had a shoulder operation 6 months ago, so like the weight of the camera, the weight of having to translocate. We were talking about like moving animals, but moving the equipment from the US to Argentina. There's no lab in Argentina to process 16 mil to process film, so I was lugging it all back to the US to process. So like this weight of having of equipment is something that I'm thinking about a lot now because I can't go back to doing that because my shoulder's so weak. Although the operation went well and everything, but I don't want to have another operation. So like these are things like there's more like the physical, like I guess filmmakers don't talk that much about the physicality of having to make a film, but there's this like physical and mental weight to really, and this was the film that I've most struggled with from when a lot of things like relationships with people, but also like just the weight of equipment as well. So yeah, that was very challenging.
In terms of what people can take away from watching the film, I mean, maybe there is something in and of itself in that sense of patience that obviously, you had in order to make the film, and these wonderful moments that you can experience if you have that patience. There's sort of that element of it, but also exploring this nuanced gray area. It's not necessarily for or against the concept of animals in captivity, but it is exploring perhaps that conflict between this amazing amount of care from the carers, but then the fact that they are there in these institutions. So what do you hope people will go away thinking about after watching it?
I think it is. I don't try and, like you say, I don't try and make a case against zoos, but I think I am against zoos. Like there is, but it is a process. I think what like this idea of patience and process, you can't just open the gates to a zoo and let all the animals free. There are animals in there that can't be freed. There's money involved. It's expensive to translocate animals. They can hardly afford food to feed them. So it's a whole. There's like a lot of nuances within these spaces, and I think that's what I'm interested in here, and kind of looking at the history of it as well, which isn't that long ago. Like there's a lot that has been changed in 100 years. What conservation was seen as 100 years ago and today is hugely different, and that it needs to keep on changing as well. And there's like a contrast between the body of the institution and the body of the workers, of the people who are on the ground working with these animals every day. So kind of highlighting that, I think, is very key for me in this film, but also in a lot of my films.
And I know the film already premiered in Locarno, I believe, but and so, how was that experience? But what does it mean to you to be bringing it here to London?
It's really special to bring it to London and for it to be in documentary competition as well. Normally, it would probably be put in experimental or something like that. So it's really special for it to be seen as a documentary in competition for a film that's not a classical documentary in kind of my hometown. So yeah, I'm really excited to share it with audiences there. I think there's something very particular about seeing it in a cinema as well, although it works online, but something to do with like the close-ups and the incredible sound. I've been working with the same sound designer in London for 10 years, Philippe Champy. He creates this incredible 5.1 soundscape that yeah, I really hope people will be able to hear that and see it in the cinema.
And if you've already got your eyes on your next project, or you need to sort of recover both physically
I
and
need a minute.
this one.
I need a minute. I have an exhibition that just opened in Spain, which is kind of a new project, which actually has to do with the history of surveillance footage of camera traps. So again, it's kind of a development from ideas that I had while making this film. But yeah, that's also kind of that opened 2 weeks ago, and then in January it will go to Rotterdam during Rotterdam Film Festival. It will be in an exhibition space. But yeah, right now I'm taking a minute and traveling a lot as well with the film. But yeah.
All right, well, enjoy that. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with me. Congratulations on the film, and really enjoy presenting it here in London. Thanks so much.